The Mississippi novelist William Faulkner once wrote that the past is never dead, it's not even past. We live in a country that encourages us to cultivate very short memories, to live as if the past was entirely irrelevant to the shape of the society we are embedded in. This willful amnesia is not some natural occurrence. It is a cultivated habit of mind with deep roots in American culture, and its effects are felt strongly in our politics. One of the most harmful of these effects is the enormous difficulty most people have with contextualizing explosive political events, like the mass protests that followed the police murder of George Floyd. That these protests arose from frustration with brutal policing and deep inequality is self evident. That these protests emerged out of the fundamental racial divisions that have defined American society for centuries is equally self evident. But far less self evident is the extent to which the shape and style and prospects of the movements driving these protests are determined by deeper historical patterns. One flashpoint of the protests have been statues and memorials to the Confederate States of America. Black Lives Matter protesters have targeted these statues as obvious, tangible symbols of the white supremacist order they are challenging. They point out that most of these statues were built decades after the Confederacy was crushed and were meant to celebrate not the memory of Confederate soldiers, but the post war restoration of white supremacy following the failure of Reconstruction. The period from 1865 to 1877 that we call Reconstruction amounted to a social revolution, one that ended in failure. In this period, coalitions of freedmen and poor Southern whites, with the aid of the Republican Party and the Federal Army, tried to build an interracial democracy on the ruins of slavery and the plantation aristocracy. It was, in effect, a continuation of the Civil War. Terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts that intimidated and murdered black political activists and their white allies were mainly composed of Confederate veterans. Defeated by the Union Army on the battlefield, these ex Confederates avenged themselves by helping defeat Reconstruction and restore a conservative white regime capable of implementing the brutally unequal system we call Jim Crow. This struggle went on for 3 times as long as the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. But its impact and its legacy, even today, remains largely out of sight and blotted out from collective memory. A closer look at this period of social revolution suggests that some of the political pathologies we see as unique to our own time have deeper roots than we'd suspect. The abrasive, erratic President Andrew Johnson, whose reflective racism and opposition to black equality led to his impeachment by the radical Republicans in Congress, bears more than a passing similarity in style to fellow impeached President Donald Trump. The elaborate efforts to deny the vote to freed slaves set the pattern for voter suppression that continues until today. And the violence many feared as a result of the 2020 elections echoes with the actual violence of Reconstruction era elections, in which white guerrilla groups attacked black voters or simply overturned election results by force. In South Carolina, North Carolina, Louisiana, Tennessee, and elsewhere in the South, governments of black and white officials elected under universal male suffrage were violently overthrown by terrorists. This belated Confederate victory relied on the passivity of the North. After 4 years of war, most Northerners were eager to move on, to put the past behind them and concentrate on the tried and true American ambitions of prosperity and expansion. The slaves had been freed. What happened to them then was their problem. Devoting more time and treasure and lives to create some utopian democratic South was a hard sell to Northern voters. The long term result of this was Jim Crow, the system of rigid segregation so total that it directly inspired the racial policies of Nazi Germany and South African apartheid. Americans often like to boast that our democracy is the most durable and longest established in the world. But as most political scientists will tell you, if we use universal suffrage as a measurement, the United States wasn't a full democracy until the 1965 Voting Rights Act guaranteed the vote for Southern blacks. The Jim Crow regimes that law helped destroy were one party authoritarian regimes. The Democratic Party controlled all key elective offices, and its leaders were almost exclusively drawn from the white economic elite. Not only were black citizens denied the right to vote, along with other civil disabilities, but the laws that excluded them also excluded a number of poor rural white voters. From the perspective of the ruling elite, this was an acceptable price to pay for black disenfranchisement. After all, if the whole point of Jim Crow was to hobble democracy, excluding poor whites did not produce an ideological or moral problem for the system's architects. One could easily argue that the period of Civil War and Reconstruction, from 1861 to 1877, is the fulcrum on which American history turns. The vexed questions of race and democracy, which has conditioned the development of American politics at every step, became direct objects of political struggle. But until very recently, such public memory as there was of Reconstruction was cast in a totally different light. To the extent that Reconstruction was remembered, it was remembered as a shameful and confused period, one that inverted the normal social order and had to be put right through extraordinary means. The central argument, made famous by propagandists like Thomas Dixon, historians like Charles Dunning, filmmakers like D.W. Griffith, and the historian turned President Woodrow Wilson, was that the introduction of democracy to the South gave power to former slaves, who were assumed to be constitutionally incapable of self government. The result was corruption, incompetence, and chaos forced upon the white South by Northern do gooders, which ultimately became so dangerous it had to be met with force. In this view, the installation of Jim Crow was merely a restoration of the proper order of things, a white dominated society in which blacks were entirely powerless. That this elaborate web of propaganda became the default view of Reconstruction throughout the country for decades is in many ways the result of the unprecedented culture shaping power of motion pictures. In 1915, the movie industry that had settled in Hollywood was poised for the first of its major creative breakthroughs. Movies would no longer be short, trifling stories and sketches. Filmmakers began to experiment with longer films, more elaborate stories, and experimental special effects. This was the moment of the birth of the blockbuster, which any fan of Marvel movies or Star Wars knows to be the dominant form of movie making today. The first blockbuster film, which captured the imagination of the country, was a piece of propaganda aimed at Reconstruction. Based on Thomas Dixon's novel The Klansman and directed by D.W. Griffith, it told the story of two white families, North and South, who are divided by the Civil War, but are later reconciled and join forces to overthrow black rule in the South. Joining together in the uniform of the Klan, they bond in their violent reassertion of white supremacy. This theme of reconciliation based on black subordination is ominously reflected in the film's title, The Birth of a Nation. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southerner and a historian, commented that the film was like history written with lightning. Wilson well knew that the film was essentially a piece of myth making, but his instinct regarding the film's effect was basically correct. The grim detail that W.E.B. Du Bois chronicles in Black Reconstruction in America, though written with compelling vigor, is hard pressed to compare to the impact of a motion picture, a form of art well suited to stirring emotion while discouraging deeper thought. This is something to consider in regard to the recent controversies over the demolition of Confederate statues. Those defenders of Confederate monuments that do not want to simply endorse the lost cause that those monuments represent often shield themselves behind the argument that attacking monuments is attacking history. In this view, to remove Confederate statues is to attack history itself, supposedly pushing some subjects and some experiences entirely out of sight. Entertaining this argument, though, should require us to think more about the ways in which history is muddled or stretched or rewritten entirely in ways that we are hardly aware of. The obscure heroes of Du Bois's account, many of whom died violently, have been written out of their own history for more than a century. The very history many seek to defend is itself a perversion of the record, a set of agreed upon lies that tell a comforting story to a defeated people. That these lies required erasing the black freedom struggle was part of its appeal. This brief sketch of extremely fraught questions is meant to convey a simple fact that often goes unacknowledged. History is not set in stone merely because we think of it as existing in the past. History is an open field that changes constantly. In a sense, it depends upon the present for its very shape. After all, we are all products of history whether we know it or not. Everything about our lives is the product of decisions made in a more or less remote past. This is what Faulkner meant when he said the past is not dead and is not gone. It's incarnated in all of us, at every moment. What matters is what we do about it.